Zibakalam, how aligned are these groups to Iran, and is Iran giving them weapons?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. They are very much close to Iran. That is the Muqtada Sadr's group. But I think the basic point is that if the United States decides unilaterally to attack a Shiite group, or for that matter a Sunni group or a secular group, that would be in direct violation of the sovereignty of Nouri Maliki's government. Because first of all, one ought to ask this simple question of Washington, that whether or not you do recognize the independence and the sovereignty of the Iraqi government. Now, if the United States, if Iran, if Turkey, if Saudi Arabia, if whoever decides to operate and to maneuver irrespective of the wishes of the present Iraqi government, I think that would be chaos.
Arash Aramesh, do you agree with that? Do you agree with unilateral action taken by US troops in their own defense is in direct contradiction of the sovereignty of the Iraqi government?
If the Iranian government is distributing weapons and is training terrorists in Iraq, some of whom are in line with the Sadrist movement, then the U.S. government has the right to protect itself. It is not against the sovereignty of the Iraqi state. The Iraqi government has fought the Sadrists before. A couple years ago, major fights were waged in the cities of Basra and Najaf and Kufa and the Sadr city in Iraq against the Jaish al-Mahdi, the Mahdi army, and it seemed that they retreated. The question here is how much influence actually Muqtada al-Sadr does have on the most radical elements of his own Mahdi army, and to what extent he's being played and used by the Iranian government. The American military presence in Iraq is now no longer a combat presence. It is solely training and support for the Iraqi government. But if American soldiers and coalition soldiers are attacked on Iraqi soil, then the U.S. has the right and does reserve the right to protect itself and to defend itself.
What evidence is there that these groups are being supplied by Iran?
There is evidence and there's intelligence that the Mahdi army has received material and other support from the Islamic Republic. Muqtada al-Sadr spent a great deal of time in the past few years in Tehran. When he had no longer a place in Iraq, he fled and went to Qom, the holy city of Qom. The Islamic Revolutionary Guards Forces, the IRGC, has been very active in training the Badr Brigade, who have been quite silent in the past few years. They're the Hakim forces. But recent cache of weapons that have been found in Iraq, these findings are quite disturbing, to the point that the Iranian government has become so audacious and so open about selling and sending weapons that they no longer even clear or clean the serial numbers or the tags on these weapons. It's quite easy to trace them back to Iran. And this is very destabilizing. Iran is interfering directly in the affairs of a sovereign country, Iraq, and it has to end. It's very destabilizing for the region and for Iraq in particular.
Sadegh Zibakalam, indeed the US itself has said that Iran is increasingly leaving its fingerprints on weapons used against its forces. Why would it be doing that?
Well, first of all, we mustn't forget that there is more than 3 decades of hostility between Iran and the United States. And in much the same way that the United States recognize her rights to seek its national security, its interest, call it what you like, in Iraq, we must also recognize that by the same token, the Islamic Republic has every right to do whatever that Tehran feels and thinks that is appropriate for its national security. Second, there is a simple question from Washington. Has Mr. Nouri Maliki's government asked you to take care of Muqtada Sadr's army, militia, and fighters, or not?
But how how is it appropriate to supply weapons to militia in Iraq to protect Iran's national security? How are US troops in Iraq threatening Iran's national security?
Well, for the simple reason that time and again United States has threatened to use military action against Iran over its nuclear program, over its political operation, etc., etc. In other words, we must remember that United States is deemed by Tehran as a hostile force, and it's only appropriate and logical that the Islamic regime take whatever measure that Tehran feels appropriate for her security and defense.
Raed Jarrar, if I can bring you back in at this point, do you agree that the US troops in Iraq threatens Iran's national security, or is Iraq simply being used as a ground for a proxy war?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I find it very ironic that both of your other guests, they condemn one side of the intervention and seem to justify the other. I think the general mood in Iraq is there is a sentiment that is against all interventions, whether it came from Iran or the United States of America. So it's not about where the intervention comes from, it's about it happening. I think some of the claims that were made in the last few minutes are laughable. When a foreign government is interfering in Iraq to protect Iraq's sovereignty from another intervention, what does that mean?
Arash Aramesh, if you could perhaps look at those comments and just clear up for us how indeed Iran or the US is protecting Iraq's sovereignty.
The presence of US forces in Iraq is a political and a military reality. American forces are there. Combat forces have withdrawn, but there are American troops and coalition troops still present in Iraq. It is not a question of interference or meddling with internal affairs, yet it's a question of American soldiers and American personnel coming under attack by Iranian forces or forces supported by Iran, and that does give the US the right to protect her citizens and to protect her interests when we have thousands of troops still left in Iraq. The problem here is not solely the U.S. presence in Iraq, but it's Iran's regional ambitions to try to expand its sphere of influence in neighboring countries, not only in neighboring countries, but in other Arab countries in the Persian Gulf, and also in the Levant region, in Syria and in Lebanon. And that raises many, many red flags for U.S. national security. And again, as far as Iraq and American soldiers and American troops present in Iraq is concerned, the U.S. does have the right to take action against those who attack its citizens.
Sadegh, Zibakalam, if we can just stay on this point. Oh, please, please, Raed Jarrar, go ahead.
I mean, I wanted to comment on this notion. It's legally and morally not valid to say that the U.S. Foreign military troops here in Iraq have the right to defend themselves. I understand, when you look at it on the micro scale, that might be correct. But when we look at the larger picture, the U.S. forces should not be in Iraq to start with. This is not it's not just what I'm saying. It's what the bilateral security agreement between the U.S. and Iraq says. All of the U.S. forces must leave Iraq before the end of this year. This is a binding agreement between the two countries, and I think that is the strategic way to stop the attacks against the U.S. soldiers in Iraq. The strategic way is not to keep U.S. troops and start attacking Iraqis and attacking Iranians, but rather get the U.S. out of this mess that the U.S. should not have came into it to start with. Get it out, as President Obama has promised, and that will ensure that no U.S. soldiers are killed, and that it will ensure that the U.S. will stop interfering in Iraq and stop breaching Iraq's sovereignty.
Okay, well, let's just take this moment to take a look at where we are with the presence of U.S. troops in Iraq. Some 46,000 remain there, and they're supposed to be leaving by the end of this year. But the Iraqi government still hasn't said whether it wants at least some of them to remain beyond that 2011 deadline. Now, US officials have said that Iraq cannot handle the full range of threats it faces without continued American assistance. But the idea remains controversial in Iraq, where hardline politicians are against any extension of the American presence in their country. Now, Iraq's decision should be announced in 2 weeks. Now, we did see some rather undiplomatic outbursts of frustration from Leon Panetta over this indecision. I mean, he actually said, "Damn it, make a decision." Raed Jarrar, you're against the US troops being in Iraq, but why is it taking the Iraqi government so long to say that it doesn't want them there anymore?
Yeah, you know, I don't disagree with the notion that the Iraqi armed forces are still weak. I personally do not think that the Iraqi armed forces are trained enough, and I don't think the Iraqi armed forces have the correct political alliances either. I think the Iraqi armed forces have a crisis of legitimacy, have a crisis of being allied to their government and country instead of the current situation where they're allied to their political parties. But all of this does not justify a longer US or other types of interventions. You see, the point that I'm trying to make here is that the US and Iranian interventions must end, not because Iraq is ready and it's a beautiful country that everyone is happy. It's actually the contrary. My point is that the US and Iran must end their interventions as soon as possible to allow for Iraqis to work on building their nation, on building the armed forces that have been destroyed, on building the political process that has been mostly a sham so far. So I think what I'm talking about is both what the majority of the Iraqis have been talking about in the last few years. The Iraqi public opinion is overwhelmingly against American and Iranian and other interventions in Iraq. And I think what we're talking about is a binding security agreement that was signed by the US and Iraqi governments. It's agreed upon, and I think it's for the best of both nations to go ahead and end this military intervention by the end of this year.
Okay, Sadegh, Zibakalam, let's just pick up there a little bit, because if we saw the US withdrawing, would we also see an end to Iranian involvement in Iraq?
Nora, you see, may I just respond to what Aramesh said in Paris earlier on. Some of his comments, in my opinion, were quite ironical, because you see, Iran recognizes the sovereignty, the integrity, and the independence of Iraq government. Now, the Iraqi government, that is to say, Nouri Maliki's government, has been in a very amicable and cordial relations with Tehran. It is the United States who is complaining against Iran's behavior in Iraq. Now, that is very ironical, that the Iraqi government has no complaint against Iran. It is the United States that has complained against Iran. Now, that's a very ironical situation that Mr. Aramesh is trying to defend on behalf of the United States.
Mr. Aramesh, your chance to respond. If we saw the US removed from the equation, would we have amicable neighborly relations?
Amicable would be a nice word if this was an ideal situation. I want to address a couple of points. First point is, in an ideal world, it would be nice to see American troops leave. And the American people would like nothing more than to see their sons and daughters come home safely. However, we know from experience that the Iraqi military is not ready to defend itself. A few years ago, when the Iraqi military under the command of Prime Minister Maliki went to fight the Jaish al-Mahdi, the Mahdi army, about 1,500 Iraqi soldiers defected because they didn't want to fight against fellow Shiites. So there are sectarian issues, there are legitimacy issues, there are tribalism. There's tribalism and sectarianism within the armed forces in Iraq. And if the U.S. is asked to leave, as it is going to do at the end of the year, the U.S. should leave. However, if the Iraqi government, the very sovereign Iraqi government, about which your guests have talked about, does ask the U.S. to stay and provide some sort of security and protective measures inside Iraq, then the U.S. will think about that. Back to Mr. Zibakalam's points, the Iraqi government has complained about Iranian meddling and Iranian interference. Iran has consistently shelled with heavy artillery Iraqi border in north and northeast Iraq, has consistently sent troops and has consistently shelled with artillery, along with the Turks from the north. So it's not as if the Iranians here are playing nice and just trying to fight off the American invasion. They are trying to expand their sphere of influence and also protect their own interests. Again, if at the end of the year, the Iraqi government asks the Americans not to stay any longer, the U.S. should respect that. But that's something up to the Iraqi government, the elected, legitimate Iraqi government, to ask the U.S.
Raed Jarrar, is the Iraqi government, which, let's face it, doesn't even have a cabinet, doesn't have a defense minister, doesn't have an interior minister, is it ready to be without U.S. troops? Can it create a secure environment for its country?
As I mentioned earlier, I'm not saying that the Iraqi government is capable and completely ready to run the country by itself, and therefore the U.S. should leave. My argument is the exact opposite. It's the contrary of that. I think the Iraqi government is incapable of running the country and does not have enough legitimacy because of the U.S. presence. It's because the government is seen as a puppet government to a foreign occupation. I think the U.S. withdrawal should not come as a result to Iraq solving its problems. The U.S. withdrawal is actually a requirement that the Iraqi government could become able to move forward and build the country and protect Iraq's sovereignty and build the Iraqi armed forces to have a better future. So I think the U.S. withdrawal is essential. It's extremely important, the U.S. withdraws. And I'm saying this both as an American and as an Iraqi. It's extremely important for both nations that this military occupation ends by the end of this year. That will help us as Americans move on and deal with other issues internally and internationally, and it will help Iraqis move on and start building their nation by themselves rather than having another layer of complications, which is caused by our presence as Americans.
But it does appear, doesn't it, with Leon Panetta's visit and his comments of unilateral action against these Shia groups, the exact opposite may well be taking place. Sadegh, Zibakalam, if unilateral action is taken by U.S. presence in Iraq, how might that provoke further Iranian involvement?
Well, the simple question is, what kind of Iraq is best suited for the Islamic Iran? But the answer is that a democratic, a stable, and a peaceful Iraq is what it is most appropriate as far as Iran is concerned. Because in that case, Iran would look upon Iraq as a huge market for investment, for oil technology, etc., etc. In other words, what I'm really trying to say is that Iran has no incentive, Iran has no objective, Iran has no desire that to see Iraq felt with insecurity, with lots of armies, with lots of foreign intervention. The only Iraq that actually benefits the Islamic Republic is a peaceful and democratic Iraq.
Arash Aramesh, what's your take on that? What's your view that Iran simply wants to see a peaceful Iraq?
I couldn't disagree more. I'm very familiar with the works of Dr. Zibakalam, and I'm quite stricken here to hear his take that the Iranian government is seeking a democratic Iraq. The Iranian government wants to destabilize Iraq. The Iranian government would like to turn Iraq into a satellite state. And unfortunately, to take advantage of the sectarian cleavages inside Iraq, support Shiite groups, some of whom are extremely radical, for its own advantage. Iran does not pursue any democratic ambitions in Iraq, as history shows.
We do have to leave our discussion there, so it's been very interesting. We do hope to return to it at some point. I'm sure we will. Many thanks to our guests, Raed Jarrar in Iraq, Sadegh Zibakalam in Tehran, and Arash Aramesh in Paris. And thank you too for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Any comments, suggestions, do email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.